Chapter 8. Mrs. President. Abigail couldn't be in Philadelphia in 1797 when her husband was sworn in as the second President of the United States. She was caring for John's 89-year-old mother, who would die in her arms. John begged Abigail to join him. He wrote, "I never wanted your advice and assistance more in my life." Abigail had avoided Philadelphia for 5 years, and she dreaded the exhausting trip on terrible muddy roads. But when Abigail arrived she swung into action. She got up at 5 a.m. to write letters, plan the day, and organize the servants. Breakfast was at 8. She saw guests from 11 to 2 and had dinner with the family at 3. After that, she visited wives of men in the government until sundown. In the evening, she held dinners for important people. She also organized giant celebrations for New Year's Day and July 4th. Despite her full days, she still remained the president's advisor. Her husband said, "I can do nothing without you." She was so involved, people called her Mrs. President. As Abigail feared, the presidency came with many problems. One was the threat of war with France. While trying to reason with the French, John created the Department of the Navy. Abigail thought he should declare war, but John disagreed. Within the United States, John was under constant attack from his political enemies. No matter what he did, their harsh words were misery for Abigail. She thought criticizing the president was treason, even when she agreed with the criticism. During the summer of 1798, while at home at Peacefield, Abigail fell so sick she feared she might die. John was home with her, and he said it was the most gloomy summer of his life. Abigail was still not well when John had to go back to Philadelphia without her in the fall. But as soon as she felt better, Abigail was able to supervise the building of a new barn. When Abigail finally joined John in Philadelphia, she brought their son Thomas, their daughter Nabby, and Nabby's daughter Caroline. Another election was coming up soon. Abigail feared that her husband wouldn't win a second term as president in 1800. She knew that he would take defeat very personally. Then, in December 1799, George Washington died at age 67. The whole country went into mourning. He was known as the father of the country. Indeed, people felt that they had suffered a personal loss. Abigail said, "No man ever lived more deservedly beloved and respected." A new capital city, Washington, was planned in his honor. Washington was much farther south, near Virginia. A new house for the president was being built there. It later became known as the White House. The President's House. Building of the President's House began in 1792 and was done mostly by slaves and immigrants. It took 8 years and still wasn't finished when the Adamses moved in. The original building was supposed to be 3 stories high and much bigger, but its size had to be cut back because of shortages of material and labor. The house was originally called the President's Palace, or the President's House, but in time people called it the White House because of its whitewashed color. In 1814, during the War of 1812, the British ransacked and burned down the White House. Nothing was left except the outside walls, and they had to be torn down. It took only 2 years to rebuild. It was finished in 1817, though there have been many additions to it since then. The Adamses went home for the summer and made more additions to Peacefield. In the fall of 1800, John moved to the new president's house in Washington, and Abigail followed. However, on the way there, Abigail's carriage got lost in the wilderness, and it took an extra day to arrive. When she finally did, she saw that Washington was not much more than a village in a swamp. Abigail was taken aback. "It is the very dirtiest hole I ever saw. A quagmire after every rain." The house was unfinished, cold and damp, even with fires roaring in 13 fireplaces. Abigail hung clothes to dry in the east room. The Adamses didn't know if they would live there for only a few months or 4 years. The presidential election would be held in December. John was not a popular leader. Some people thought he was vain and wanted to be like a king, which John strongly denied. He was known to be stubborn and too opinionated. It was looking like the Adamses' stay in Washington might be short. John Adams did lose the election, but just as Abigail feared, too, Thomas Jefferson. Both John and Abigail felt humiliated and angry. On top of the defeat, in 1800, they heard that their son Charles had died. It was a terrible blow. Charles was only 30 years old. Abigail was especially sad because Charles had been such a charming child. But his life had been destroyed by drinking. The only good news was that the war with France had been avoided. John had worked hard for that. People had thought that the war was a sure thing. John was very proud of maintaining peace. It was the greatest achievement of John Adams's presidency. After only 3 months in Washington, Abigail happily left for Peacefield. John followed a few weeks later. He had missed too much family life. "I must be a farmer," he said, and that's just what he became. Abigail and John didn't need to write any more letters to each other ever again.